Inside this room, all of my dreams become realities, and some of my realities become dreams.
What in the wide, wide world of sports is going on here? Alive! It's alive! It's alive!
You are listening to The Wilder Ride, getting wilder by the minute. Here are your hosts, Alan Sanders and Walt Murray.
Welcome back, everybody, to The Wilder Ride, getting wilder by the minute, a podcast that celebrates the films of Gene Wilder 1 minute at a time. And in Season 2, we are diving into the film Blazing Saddles 1 Spit, Burp, Anal Johnson minute at a time. I'm Alan Sanders.
And I'm Walt Murray.
And it is my pleasure to welcome two very strong historians about the cowboy genre, everything about the cowboy. I'll start off first in studios. We've got Jim Dunham. Good evening, Jim.
Well, how are you? Howdy, my friend.
Good to have you here. And joining us by phone, we actually have a black cowboy reenactor. We've got Dwayne Towns. Dwayne, welcome.
How are you doing?
Very well. Thanks for joining us. Let me go ahead and set the stage at where we are in this minute, and then we will let you guys talk a little bit about who you are and where you all come from. This is Thursday. This is your 14th minute that we are covering for you, and it really ends just as Taggart is being lulled into comfort from Hedley Lamar. But what's most important is we begin the Ballad of Rock Ridge. We get to see a day in the life of the town of Rock Ridge, and we will end just as the marauders are starting to ride through town causing some mischief. So first and foremost, Jim, I'll go to you. Give us just a little bit of background of why would you think we'd invite you on a Wild West podcast like Blazing Saddles?
well, back in the 60s, I actually was under contract with 20th Century Fox Films to teach movie stars how to be cowboys. And and I basically taught them how to handle a gun, how to draw a gun safely and fast, spin, twirl the gun, roll it back in the holster. And then when they stopped making Westerns, I had an agent who booked me as a banquet speaker, and I traveled around and performed a show which kind of compared the historical West with the way the movies have portrayed it. And for the last 15 years, I'm the historian for the Booth Western Art Museum here in Cartersville, Georgia.
So you kind of have a pretty good sense of the history of the real West versus the Hollywood West.
That's absolutely correct.
All right, let's go over to our other guest now. And Dwayne, tell us a little bit about your background with cowboys and cowboy history.
Well, I've been a cowboy since I was 10 years old. I've been riding horses since I was 10. I fell in love with the Tournament of Roses Parade when I was 10, which led me to become a historian of the American West. I didn't know much about black cowboys, of one of which I am. Being a part of the West, I was always assured that there weren't any black cowboys. But I've learned after deeper discovering that 1 out of 4 cowboys in the American West was of African-American descent. That led me to do further research in becoming a bull rider, a steer wrestler, and further meeting, it led me to meet oh my God. Hey, we started over, guys.
We got it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Phil's a good friend of mine. He wrote for Guns and Ammo magazine, and both you guys are mounted cowboy shooters.
Yeah. I started the Georgia Cowboy Mounted Shooting Association off my relationship with Phil Spangenberger and becoming a spirit of the West Riders, who are a group of 17 riders usually who participate in the Tournament of Roses Parade on January 1st every year. That was the greatest pinnacle of my horsemanship, being a cowboy from 10 up until now. I train, I rope, I shoot, and I'm very much in love with the history of the American West. I met Mr. Herb Jeffries, who was the first all-black cast singing Western star in 1938 in movies like the Bronze Buckaroo. Good Lord, what is wrong with me? Lord help me.
Yeah, he made quite a few of them, and he was a really fine singer. What a good singer he was.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jim. He made 4 Westerns. When somebody saw a black child fighting with some white children in an alley, saying that he couldn't be a black cowboy because there were no black cowboys. So that motivated him to do Harlem Rising Range, Harlem on the Prairie, Two-Gun Man from Harlem. And Herb personally told me that he got tired of the Two-Gun Man from Harlem and Harlem Rising Range, and he told them to go to a name that signified him as to become the Bronx Buckaroo. So we were friends until his death in 2014. But I've always loved everything about cowboys, and I still do to this date.
Well, that is fantastic. So we've got the experts we need because we're about to go into the town for the first time. Walt, we've heard it mentioned. We know that Hedley Lamar has a plan. He wants to run everybody out of Rock Ridge because the railroad's about to go through, and he's going to scoop up this land for nothing if he can get the people, the rightful owners, out of the way and can buy it all up. So he's decided to work up a number 6. So we're going to see gunfighters riding into town. We're going to see a riding and a wumping, every living thing within an inch of its life. But we start off with a day in the life of.
There was a peaceful town called Rock Ridge, where people lived in harmony. They never had no kind of trouble. There was no hint of misery.
So, Jim, I'm going to go to you first. The opening shot here shows kind of like Main Street, I guess. How many streets, or would this be typical of just of a smaller town to have kind of like just one main drag in and out of town?
Most of the towns that developed that were cattle towns had one main street, and it was usually that they were not too far away from the railroad. And like Dodge City, it had Front Street, which was on the north side of the railroad, and then the less nice part of town, the brothels and the saloons and so forth, were south of the railroad tracks in the south side of town. Wrong side of the tracks.
So the other side of the tracks, right?
One of the things about this town that is authentic, and that's that these towns were built they were new. They weren't broken down, beat up towns, and many of them were false fronts. And they were tall. Some of them have 2 stories, and the hotels and the banks and things like that might very well be either brick or batten. And they did have wide streets because you had freighters, you had stagecoaches, you had all of this stuff. Now, they're kind of in the movie, they're kind of like all driving the way we drive today.
I was going to ask you, did they drive on the right side of the road?
And that wouldn't have been true. If you look at photographs of some of these old early towns, especially there's some great photographs of Deadwood, South Dakota, and there's like 12 wagons in the street, and they're all going in different directions. And it's really real confusing and real messy. But they definitely would have had a lot of width to the main street. They probably just didn't have very many other streets. There would have been scattered homes that were on the other side of this main street. But the main street usually was just like one big long street. Every movie studio has a western town, and the best one is Paramount. Paramount's western town is great, and Paramount's western town is a V, and so you can have stuff going to the left, stuff going to the right, coming back, and you actually have the illusion that it's a big town, even though it's just 2 streets in Paramount's studio. And, of course, most of these sets are probably flanking sound stages. So, in other words, there's no depth to those buildings. And then once you enter the building, you have to go on a set somewhere because you can't shoot inside those buildings. Those buildings are only about 12 inches deep.
So some of these things we're hearing about, both the sound stages on the other side and the fact that these were probably false facades that once you went in through the front door, you'd be in a separate location. That's to go correct. Film inside. Mel Brooks is going to pull the curtain back on all of that by the end of this movie. Yes, he is. Well, let me ask this. At the very opening shot here, you see a kid come running off left of screen with 3 dogs pulling him down the street. Was a dog walking typical of the Old West?
There were certainly dogs. I don't know if they actually had them. I don't know if they had them on lines. I suppose they could. You do have families because as soon as the town starts to grow, you have to have a reason, and the reason is usually the railroad. The towns don't get real big unless there's a way to get the product somewhere, and so you've got cattle towns like Dodge City and Abilene and Wichita, and you have mining towns which are like Tombstone and towns like Deadwood. Tombstone, the railroad wasn't anywhere near close, but you had freighting, and people would freight the ore from Tombstone up to Benson, where they could load the freight on the railroad car. So there wasn't a railroad near Tombstone, but at least you could go in and freight it out.
All right, well, I already see a problem here. Do you?
Yeah, I've got a couple problems.
I mean, we've got a huge, thriving metropolis in the Old West, and the railroad has yet to come through.
Has yet to come.
And in fact, the railroad's going to come through and destroy the town.
Yeah, that's
the
right.
railroad's going to destroy the town of Rock Ridge.
A little backwards.
Dwayne, I know you and I chatted a little bit ago to get you ready to come on and join us, and you actually mentioned that this is one of your favorite movies. You remember actually seeing Blazing Saddles as a kid. So before we continue down the discussion of Main Street, give us your thoughts about Blazing Saddles and kind of where it fits in your mind as far as not only as a Western, but also as making some social commentary for its day.
Well, definitely some social commentary. As a Western, it was the funniest Western I've ever seen in my life. I've seen some funny ones. I actually didn't see it until I was actually in college. My freshman year of college, on Wednesday night, they would invite all the students over to the movie house. And when I saw it, what really captured my attention was looking around and seeing all the nationalities that were over to see the movie, and that everybody from white to black to Hispanic to Chinese, Japanese, they were laughing their heads off with the satire and the scenes. And I also liked the way it showed a African-American cowboy in the saddle, which, as I said earlier, 1 out of 4 cowboys in the West was African-American descent, but not many people knew that, not even black people. So the satire that was wrapped around it and how it brought him out being a hero, that really had me sticking my chest out and wanted me to know more.
Jim, isn't it interesting that as a comedy, a guy who wrote this wanted to he said, I wanted to bring to light what was happening in 1974 with equality and rights, but I thought the way to kind of jar the audience would be set it in the Old West. And yet it tends to be more correct in terms of its demographic.
It is a contemporary humor. There's no question about it. Another one that is a comedy Western is Cat Ballou. And Cat Ballou maybe has a little more tied to the older period, to an older period. This comedy is very modern, very contemporary.
But isn't it amazing that even though it was supposed to be sort of a comedy and sort of a parody, it actually captured the diversity of the West better than most of the movies did at the time.
And what I think it's sad, we've lost the ability for people to make humor of themselves. Now, we've never thought that it was appropriate for, say, a Jewish comic to make fun of, say, a Catholic or whatever. But Jewish comics were always allowed to make Jewish jokes, jokes about their own culture and how their mother behaved and a typical Jewish mom, and black comics, from Richard Pryor to whoever, were always allowed to utilize the comedy within their own race and get away with that kind of humor. And now we've lost that. It's now everybody is now so sensitive that nobody can say anything. Now, I have to say that growing up in a very conservative home, a Christian home, my dad never swore. I never heard in all of our lives together. He died when I was 21. But I never heard one single swear word ever spoken in my home. So for me, it's abrasive to hear the F word. I mean, it literally rattles.
Still to this day for you.
Still to this day, and I don't use that language myself. So I think that I would have liked the movie better if they had still had the abrasiveness, still had the everybody responding, but it didn't have to be so over the top for me. But knowing when it was made and how it was made, and at the time it was made, it didn't have the same effect that if you tried to get away with it today. They wouldn't even play it today.
No, I don't think so. Dwayne, what are your thoughts on that?
I agree with Jim. I don't think they would do it today. I think it took a lot of guts for Mel Brooks to even formulate something like this and put it out. I think it shows the genius of that man. I'm glad he put it out. It's a classic. I watch it over and over again. And even though I know the film, each scene, I laugh uncontrollably each time. So I think it showed a lot of guts and a lot of daring. And to satire, in a satire form, put out the truth that was actually the way the history happened.
Yeah. Look at the TV series Hogan's Heroes. Okay, Hogan's Heroes is about a prisoner of war camp against Nazi Germany. Mm-hmm. Okay, there's no humor there.
No, I mean, not when you say it that way.
Yeah, it's
right.
And if you were to have in those shows, if you had talked about people going to the gas chamber, then of course it wouldn't have any humor at all. But they were sensitive to how you can find humor within a very difficult and inappropriate situation. And let's face it, when you're in the situation that our sheriff is in this movie, he's in an inappropriate situation, and to find humor there is very funny. And the best part of it is that he's victorious.
Right. He's the hero from the very beginning.
He conquers the bad thinking. He overcomes,
one could say he
overcomes
fear
the prejudice.
And he conquers hate.
Yeah, he overcomes the prejudice by his cleverness and by his own behavior. Mm-hmm. So that's why this movie still is funny and why it still works today, even though it's so politically incorrect.
All right, let's get back to the opening minute here that we're talking about Main Street, downtown Rock Ridge. Jim, this is actually shot on the Warner Brothers lot. Right. So you said every movie studio kind of has one of these.
Everybody had a Western set, and some of them were better than others. And the only thing is that these are all in the L.A. area, so you generally don't get any. Can't ride out of town into an open vista. You got to go somewhere else for that open space.
Well, I noticed the framing of the shot that they've got at the end of the street, some houses or facades to give you the sense that there's something blocking, so you can't see past where that row of buildings are.
Yeah, it kind of feels like the town kind of
juts to the left.
Yeah, Los Angeles is.
Yeah, we may actually see it from the ridge later of how it kind of makes an L shape. Yeah. All right, so we are going through downtown. Jim, this is 1874, according to the filmmakers, that they wanted to go, they wrote it and filmed it for a 1974 audience, so they wanted to go 100 years back in time. I wanted to ask you some of the things that we see, and then Dwayne, also feel free to jump in, too. We go past a shot of, like, the general store, and then there's a big joke here about Howard Johnson's ice cream parlor with just one flavor. Obviously, a shout out to Baskin Robbins.
That's right. Yeah, and Howard Johnson's did have a lot of flavors too.
Oh, Howard Johnson did too.
Oh yeah, Howard Johnson's had like 28 flavors.
Yeah, before Baskin Robbins,
Howard Johnson's had like 28 flavors. Yeah,
I did not know that. I should have done some. Walt, do you have some research?
Say that because I was thinking some of our younger audience might not even get.
They won't have. They don't know who Howard Johnson is.
They won't get the joke later about the orange outhouse, orange roof.
Right.
And then you got to see the general store, and so they're selling Custer, and they're selling Grant, and they're selling all the generals.
The general store.
That's right. No colonels.
That's a little inside Western historian humor there. Patton hasn't been born yet, so we can't sell him just yet.
They don't have him yet.
Well, so what do you got there, Walt?
Okay, so Howard Johnson's, for those of us who are a little older, we remember the Howard Johnsons. They were restaurants and hotels. All of them always had orange roofs. They were originally founded by Howard Deering Johnson. He had grown up in a family where his father ran a cigar shop and died, left the debt of the business to him. So he had about $10,000 in debt, worked that off by selling the business and liquidating it, and he bought an ice cream stand. So from that ice cream stand, he realized that there was a problem, and that was it didn't taste that great. So he bought a recipe from a guy for $300 who ran an ice cream cart and changed the whole way he made ice cream, and it just exploded. So it went from there to him buying a shop and changing the names of some stuff. And in 1925, when he bought that ice cream stand, he wasn't making any money. 4 years later, he was making $240,000 a year.
Wow.
Selling ice cream.
That's a nice $300 investment.
Not too bad.
Hotels.
Not too bad. Then he got into hotels. So before he got into the hotel business, he started selling hamburgers and frankfurters at the ice cream shops.
Yeah.
That exploded. And then in 1935, he started the first franchise operation and started selling franchises of the Howard Johnson's restaurants. So you started having these orange roofed buildings pop up all over the United States.
They all looked alike.
Canada. Absolutely. They all looked alike. They all had the exact same entranceway. They all had the exact same menu and recipe. So you could go from Des Moines, Iowa to New York, and you're going to have the exact same food at the exact same feeling restaurant. So then he got from there into hotels and other things. So you used to be able to drive around America and see these orange-roofed Howard Johnson buildings, and you knew that you were going to get the exact same products and service at each of those buildings. Now, there is one Howard Johnson's restaurant left. It's in Lake George, New York. It is a franchise restaurant, and the Howard Johnson Company is actually owned by the Wyndham Hotels. So they have maintained the ownership of that name, and the properties they've all sold off. So it's a very limited corporation with that one franchisee who apparently does very well. And that is it. They no longer make their own ice cream. They no longer make their own other products. And so it's kind of a shell of what the company used to be.
So it's kind of lived its full circle, as many corporations do, and history tells us over and over. I think people who can't keep up.
In this movie, it would have been very funny because people would have recognized the name, and then the idea that there was only one type of ice cream would have been funny.
Yeah,
right.
That is funny. That was their big thing, is that we have all
they
these
had like
flavors.
28 different types of ice cream. Yeah.
When you used to be able to drive around and still see the buildings that had been sold off, they had that distinctive kind of sloped roof, and the people had painted them other colors because I guess the minute they sold them off, they said it can't be orange anymore. But it was one of those distinctive things on the American and Canadian landscape.
Awesome. Well, let's quickly, before we, Howard Johnson's ice cream parlor's in the shot, but we also have a general store in the shot. It says dry goods, boots, shoes. Is that typical, Jim?
Oh, yeah. In fact, the general store really was a place where you got every kind of clothing and every kind of, it would have hardware, it would have firearms, ammunition. It was an all-purpose type of store, yeah.
And you can see Jackson Johnson as the
he owns the whole town.
Yeah, the joke that's going to play itself out in a minute here if we haven't, and you don't get it until maybe later, but certainly on repeat viewings, we know everybody in this town has the surname Johnson, right? They're all a bunch of Johnsons in this town. Fill in your own Mel Brooks joke after that.
That's right.
We also have a fashion store. Is that something as typical for, or would that be a little bit more of a established
as these towns
town?
got bigger and as they became more important, there certainly were people who had, a seamstress or whatever. In fact, when the gunfight at OK Corral takes place in Tombstone, Arizona in 1881, one of the witnesses was the lady across the street who watched it from her dressmaking store, hat making and dressmaking store, and she was a witness to the shootout and testified.
All right. I'm going to ask both of you this, Dwayne and Jim. Before we head into the saloon, there's a shot just in front of Howard Johnson's ice cream parlor where it looks like a mom and maybe a couple of moms and kids are all wearing various attire. It reminds me of Little House on the Prairie.
Yeah.
Is this, I know it's hard to tell from this long of a shot, is that a typical form of dress for 1874?
Well, the clothing in this movie is your typical TV Western clothing, not based upon historical accuracy. All the men and the women basically are dressed pretty much like they would have dressed in Bonanza and Little House on the Prairie and all of those TV shows. And none of that is correct historically.
Is anything close? In
well,
this movie?
Yeah, everything is always close.
Close.
Yeah.
but no cigar.
But generally speaking, they take liberties, and costume people come up with their own ideas, and so I think that was deliberate because they wanted this to look like a 1960s TV movie, or a film movie, not look like the historical West. Tombstone, for example. Everything is historically correct for what it looked like in the Old West. If they had done that, they would have lost some of the humor. In other words, if this town had, everybody who was period, or every actor was dressed in correct period clothing, you would have lost some of the jokes because some of the humor comes from the fact that, first of all, the jokes are funny because they're contemporary, and the language is contemporary, and then the costuming needs to be contemporary too, or else it's too glaring.
And this is a parody of the Westerns,
exactly.
Not a historical film about the Westerns.
Yeah,
So,
and how could you even begin to think that you could have a herd of cows in your saloon?
Well, Dwayne, before we get inside the saloon, I know you do. You ride, and you also are a reenactor. So, can you give your thoughts on the on costuming in this versus the reality of what would have been in place in 1874?
Well, typically, Jim is right. It's typical Hollywood movie satire costuming. So Jim is right on there. So when he rides in the blazing outfits, the Western hero rides in as. That's just movie satire. It's not period correct also.
Well, we move right into the Western bar, and I've got to ask this. Is it typical to keep your cattle right, behind you when you're, going inside to play some cards?
I always bring my cow in the room, don't you?
Yeah, I always let my cattle follow me.
Well, you're on a long ride. You're bringing them all up. It's that time of year for the cattle drive. You want to stop in, play. This guy down here in the very bottom of the screen, I don't know. He's counting money for a game where nobody else is with him.
Nobody's playing with him.
I think he's playing solitaire.
Yeah.
Is he playing solitaire?
He's playing solitaire. Okay. Well, in the movie Red River. With John Wayne and Montgomery Clift.
He's missing some cards.
Yeah,
he is. But
in Red River, they ride into town in Abilene, and the cattle completely fill the street. The whole street is full. And then Montgomery Clift goes to sell the cattle, and Harry Carey Sr., he says, how many have you got? And he says, well, we started with 9,000. We lost about 500 on the way. He says, we don't have corrals for half that many. And he says, oh, they can just stay where they are. They're okay. They can stay in the street. You know what? Those cows haven't had any water. They haven't had any food, and they're going to make a mess in the street. So not only do they not belong inside the saloon, they don't belong in town at all.
But it does make for a very funny transition.
It is a funny bit to have the cows walking around in the saloon, yeah.
Now, I've been in a couple of restaurants where I thought some cows might have been wandering around.
Usually those are the all-you-can-eat places.
Yeah, those are...
Excuse me, can I have 2 chairs to sit on?
Yeah. Or if you need a steak, I'll say, I'll take that one. That one right there.
This reminds me, did you ever read the Douglas Adams trilogy? Well, that's right, it's a 4-book trilogy. The Restaurant at the End of the Universe is book 2. And in The Restaurant at the End of the Universe, it was the whole Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy trilogy. Did you ever read that, Jim?
No, huh?
Dwayne, did you ever read that, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy?
I haven't had the pleasure.
One of the funny bits in book 2, it's called The Restaurant at the End of the Universe. And when you read the title, you think, oh, at the very edge. No, they travel in time to the very brink of the death of the universe. Oh. And the animals have all been bred to a point where they come to your table and say, which part of me would you like tonight?
Gee.
It's that fresh. They actually ask you. So maybe
that's what thinking that way. Yeah.
Could be where Douglas Adams got his idea.
Yeah.
The cows come to you.
Yeah.
That's kind of sick.
Yeah,
it's kind of sick.
Yeah, it is.
The bar looks good.
Stick around, Dwayne.
The bar looks really good. He's got spittoons. He's got a rail to put his foot on. The back bar looks excellent. The building's too big.
You told us before we went live, it's too wide.
Most like other businesses, whether saloons or general stores or whatever, would have had a narrow front, and then it would have had a long, deep building, probably pretty high ceiling. But it wouldn't have been real wide. You wouldn't have had the ability to put 25 tables in there like that and have a stage for dancing girls. Generally, they were narrow, and the bar ran along the narrow part, and so they wouldn't have been big open spaces like that.
Now, Walt, you threw me for a loop. I've seen this movie hundreds and hundreds of times. I've heard the song hundreds of times. Don't ask me why it goes in one ear and out the other.
The town saloon was always lively, but never nasty or obscene. Behind the bar stood Anal Johnson. He always kept things nice and clean.
I had no idea that the name of the bartender is Anal Johnson.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think I picked that up the first time I saw it because I laughed I was 10 or 11 when I saw the first time.
That's why it's amazing to me that I could have seen this movie that many times and just glossed right over it.
That's the thing. I'm so much more mature than you that I'm really surprised that you haven't picked that up.
But maybe it's because I'm laughing the whole time because as they're singing, I still to this day, just in time with the lyrics, have always kept things nice and clean. He spits in the glass and burps. And continues to wipe it.
Yeah, wipes it out and gives it back. Yeah, that's pretty good.
Dwayne, the first time you saw this, what was your thought of Anal Johnson behind the bar cleaning his cups with spit?
I think he was one of the nastiest individuals.
He's got cows wandering.
Spitting and cleaning, yeah.
Yeah, and he's got cows wandering around his bar, so, I mean, at that point, cleanliness has kind of gone out the window.
Yeah, they sure have, yeah.
The Cowboys are pretty dirty, too. So they stood there and let him do it, and they didn't have any reaction at all.
Yeah,
No.
didn't even.
But I just had to shake my head. Wow.
Didn't even faze him.
No, if you look, and as the music's picking up, he looks at him, and it looks like they're still in conversation. He's like nodding, yeah. Nobody even flinches with him cleaning his glasses this way. Jim, did they have beer mugs like this?
They did. They did have beer mugs, and what's surprising is that they had mixed drinks. They didn't just have rye whiskey and beer. They had gin fizzes. They had lots of mixed drinks. So Wyatt Earp testified in court that when something was happening, that the bartender was mixing their drinks, and you don't mix a beer and you don't mix a whiskey, so that means he was having something that was mixed with water. What was expensive was ice. See, now we're used to cold beer. We're used to if you go to the get yourself a nice cold beer, and it was expensive to have iced beer, and so like the Europeans drink warmer beer. They like a warmer beer, and the Old West would have had more room temperature beers than they would have had cold beers. And the same thing is true of the other kind of cocktails. If you put a piece of ice in it, that was expensive. So because ice houses and so forth that could produce ice that would last throughout the year, that was a very expensive thing to do, to have availability of ice. Yeah.
Wow. And I don't think we even see, and I don't think there's anything later that shows anybody getting ice anywhere.
No.
This is going to roll right into as the ballad changes and they start talking about, and all at once, the trouble started.
And all at once the trouble started. A pack of murderers and thieves. Like swarms of locusts they descended. Their aim to make the town bleed.
And Dwayne, I'm going to kick it over to you because you are a riding gun shooter, or
mounted shooter.
Mounted shooter. I'm going to use the proper terminology. See, I don't have to worry about it. I'm just the podcaster. I can be an idiot and say whatever I want. But Dwayne, tell us a little bit about these guys riding into town with guns ablazing.
Riding into town with guns ablazing. That is a very hard thing to do, because some horses are not accustomed to gunfire. So these horses, you would know, had quite a few guns fired around them. So running at a speed of 30 to 40, 45 miles an hour, firing a 45, it was pretty exciting. The horse was carrying you through, and you're racking up a whole lot of evil trivia at it. So,
but that was not uncommon. When a trail herd hit a town, to hurrah the town, or paint the town red, as some people say, or the most popular term was to see the elephant. They would say, when I get to town, we're going to see the elephant. And we don't know for sure if that meant that at some point somebody saw a circus with an elephant that when they went to town, or maybe they just had enough red eye that they were seeing elephants. I don't know.
See, that's the phrase I've always thought. You're so drunk.
It was a popular term used in the Old West to say that you're gonna celebrate in a very rambunctious form, and one of those forms was to ride through town, shoot your guns, even to the point that sometimes they would ride their horses into the saloons. You don't take your cattle in the saloon, but there were times when cowboys rode their horses into the saloons.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, I guess all the hitching posts were tied up.
Yeah. And
they just been paid. Correct me if I'm wrong, Jim.
Yeah.
They just been paid.
Yeah.
They were looking, they were riding with a popular term was always used, with their head bent for leather.
Yeah.
And they were looking to raise some students from hell.
Yeah.
So they were looking to burn up all that money on drink, girls, and cars. So that's what they were doing.
Yeah, they had worked 100 consecutive days with no income. The President of the United States had closed down all of the
yeah. Very contemporary issues.
That's right.
Yeah.
No, they got their food, but they slept on the ground, and it was hard work. But all of a sudden, they got 100 days' wages in cash.
Yep.
And a steak might be 50 cents, maybe 50 cents, 75 cents for a good dinner. And they had $100 in their hand, in their pockets. So, and these were mainly young men. They were young, and the reason that we had so many African Americans, which Dwayne was saying that the high percentage was Americans, because the cattle drive business doesn't start until the Civil War is over. All right, as soon as the Civil War is over, you got a lot of black men who need jobs. That they now are not they're not slaves, and they're happy about that. I mean, they're not looking forward to going back to slavehood, but they've got to go out and earn a living, and they got to support themselves. So a lot of the young black men found jobs in driving cattle north up on the railheads. And so one of the things you can say is that without exception, these men were acquainted with violence. They were all acquainted with violence. Most of them still packing guns that they had carried during the war years. So we went from a nation that had not experienced war like the Civil War to a very armed camp. Everybody now was armed and everybody was on edge. And if in most of the towns that were run by Yankee marshals, the Earps, not Holiday, but the Earps and Bat Masterson, all these guys, these are guys from Illinois and from Indiana and from Ohio. These are people who are Yankee sympathizers, and then all the cowboys are coming out of Texas and the South. And so
of course, we do a show that, stories that won the West. A lot of times the clash in the Old West, a lot of times had to do with some of those same clashes that started the Civil War.
That's right. And so the idea of riding your horses through town and shooting your guns, that would not be unusual. That part of the movie at least represents something that might really happen.
But once they start beating on people, that's different.
That's a little different.
Right around second 53, before we're starting to wrap up this minute, I wanted to ask this question because one of the storefronts you can see very quickly behind a guy getting ready to wump or lasso somebody says groceries. Would there have been a grocery store?
Boy, I don't know that there were grocery stores. Yeah, probably not. Most people still had little houses with farms. They still had gardens. I don't think there was a high demand for groceries. The people who had homes would have had a small garden to provide anything they wanted, and there would have been butcher shops. There would have been butcher shops, but I don't know that there were grocery stores.
I just thought it was interesting. They would have in this Old West town that they would use for filming, whether it was television or this movie or whatever, that you'd have a storefront painted groceries.
Yeah, I would think that most of that would be at the dry goods store.
Yeah, I think so too.
Unless they spelled it wrong and they meant that these are really bad-looking series.
Tombstone did have a ice
groceries
cream store. Tombstone had an ice cream shop.
Jim didn't even listen to me.
Tombstone had an ice cream shop?
Yeah, had an ice cream shop.
This is going to make for some good podcast editing. All right. Well, we are basically at the end of the minute because we do see the Cowboys go rolling by, and then here comes the guy with a lasso. He's basically looking like he's going to lasso one of the townspeople. Dwayne, tell us a little bit about that, because I know you talked about riding and shooting on horseback. What about doing any kind of rope work on horseback?
Oh, well, it's the same thing. They rope through there. Well, I mean, be more specific about roping. I have roped, and roping and shooting, they come through and try to rope people. Just invoke more fear in them when they were running through trying to take over the town, drag people down the street, rope them in a lasso, tied around their saddle horn and drag them, shooting them and scaring the living daylights out of them. So that was part of it.
Now, do you know how to do that as well with your background, having practice as a rider? Do you rope cattle or rope anything as well?
Oh, yeah, and to get your thumb out of the way because you go wrapping that rope around the horn.
You're a dally man. You don't tie hard and fast. Is that correct?
No, you don't.
Yeah.
So you get to this. Thank you, Jim. You get your finger out of the way when you're wrapping around that horn. It looks spectacular, but it hurts like hell when you get it It's a very, very high level technique. Yeah, I have roped 350 to 500 pound steers. I don't go any higher than that. I'm not a Bill Pickett, even though I'm a black cowboy. Yeah. It's very painful.
All right, well, we are at the end of this minute, episode number 14, as we are making our way through this movie, Blazing Saddles. Before we set the stage on what's coming tomorrow, Dwayne, let me start off with you. Were there any notes you had for this minute that we didn't cover, or you want to kind of recap for us?
No, I was happy sitting here listening because I feel kind of dumb right now because Jim is such a historian. I'm always amazed at all the rhetoric and folklore that comes out of his chops. No, it's very, very, very cool. I'm interested. I want to get deeper into it. Excuse me stuttering. I've had a flu for about 10 days. I'm trying to get over it for this, so I'll get better as we go along.
All right. Jim, did you have any other notes for this minute? Anything you wanted to mention?
I'm fine for what we have.
And Walt, what about you?
The only thing I was going to mention that we didn't talk about is Anal Johnson is played by a guy named Richard Vitagliano. This is the only movie that he is credited as acting in, which I thought was interesting because he has kind of a familiar face. But he has, but he has 4 credits as a location manager. One for films and then the rest for television. He was the location manager for 64 episodes of a show called Fantasy Island.
Oh, sure.
I'm well aware of that movie.
Yeah, the plane.
Yep, and then there was a TV movie that Yes, exactly. Yes. And then there was a TV movie that a lot of us would be familiar with, The Case of the Hillside Strangler. So he was the location manager for that as well. So
is that Internet Movie Database information?
It is. Well, and some of this, I had to dig a little bit on him because there was not a whole lot on him.
Yeah.
But that is where I at least got on the right trail with him on that. Yeah, I believe he's still around, but he is retired and out of the business.
Wow.
All right, well, then before we tell you what's coming up tomorrow, Jim, we always like to let our guests plug where people can learn a little bit more about them or find them if they've listened to this episode and go, God, that guy's interesting. Where can people learn a little bit more about the Jim Dunham?
Well, I'm on Internet Movie Database, too, of course. Yeah.
You are?
Yeah, and on Google. But the place is to come to the Booth Western Art Museum in Cartersville, Georgia, and come in the gate or the front door and go to the desk and say, is Jim available? And if you even want a cup of coffee or something, I'll come up and visit with you. We'd love to do that.
And give yourself 2 or 3 hours because once he starts talking, that time just disappears in an instant.
My wife says, ask a simple question, you get a pageant.
And if you want to learn a little bit more about that museum, it's boothmuseum.org. Check it out. It's a Smithsonian affiliate, world-class Western art museum, biggest one east of the Mississippi.
That's correct.
Dwayne, where can people learn a little bit more about you?
Well, if you want to learn more about Dwayne Towns, you can go to the webpage, ironhorseman.tripod.com/Bronze Buckaroo.
Are you on Facebook or Twitter or anything like that?
No, I'm not on Facebook or Twitter. I'm an engineer for trade, and it is just too hard for me to keep up with. So if you want to learn more about me, you can send me an email and drop me a line and learn more about me on Bronze Buckaroo.
Excellent. Walt, where can people learn a little bit more about the Wilder Ride?
Take a couple minutes, go to facebook.com/The Wilder Ride, and then from there, join our listeners group. In that group, we have information about the movies that we're working on, past projects that we've had, just about anything you want to know about us, but also a lot of discussion and posts on different Gene Wilder movies and a lot of other things. So that's a great way to get to know us, get to know other listeners and folks who are interested in the show. And I learn stuff there every week. Every week somebody posts something that is just kind of interesting about the movies or the actors. So again, that's facebook.com/The Wilder Ride, and then click the button to join the listeners group.
And come back tomorrow, folks. Friday, we're going to wrap up the week with minute number 15. We're going to continue with these marauders driving all the people of Rock Ridge crazy. We'll start off with a guy diving through a window, and we're going to end with folks in town singing, "Our town is turning." Well, we won't know turning into what. We're going to have to just deal with that 1 minute at a time. But to get all of that, you're going to have to come back tomorrow for this, The Wilder Ride.
And by the way, folks, this is not the last time you're going to see the cows. So pay attention.
Not the last time.
Yeah.
Oh, the cows are
coming back.
The cows are big. I'm surprised they're not in the IMDb database.
Are they uncredited?
Yeah. They're uncredited.
Oh, yeah, I hate when they're uncredited.
Yeah. Well, and first he...
Whoa. Somebody's trying to cook.
Sorry.
We'll beep that out. Skype, we're not answering. Go away.
That was a good wake me up.
Sorry about it, Alex.
That's okay.
Something keeps in.
Hey, it's going to keep our listeners on their toes.
I think if you try it, I think it'll work.
Well, we'll have to do it for the next episode. I don't want to break in the middle of this episode, so we'll try another one.
No,
okay.
Let's do this. Yeah, don't tear this one up. Sorry.
All right.
Okay.
My dad liked Howard Johnson hotels, and we took a trip down to Florida when I was about 10 years old, and my sister, who's 5 years younger than I am, was 5, and every night we stopped at a Howard Johnson hotel. And about the third night, my sister was crying And my dad said, "Why, Jeannie, why are you crying?" She said, "We've been driving for days and we're not getting anywhere."
We're not getting anywhere. In her mind, it looked identical, felt identical.
We keep coming back to the same place.
We're just driving in one big circle.
That is a riot.